Okay, I want to start this video out. This is going to be a sort of an unusual video because there's going to be a pre-test, and then we're going to do our presentation, and then there will be a post-test, and that way you can look and see. So a lot of you guys, the old seasoned fellows out there, are probably going to get most of the questions on the, or maybe all of them on the pre-test right. But you can see on the end, on the post-test, how it is that you did. And so before I really get into it, there's going to be a little short 10-question pre-test, and we're going to have you run through that, and then we'll get into the presentation. So I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, now that the pre-test is behind you, let's go ahead and move on with our regular presentation here. This is a little engine thing. Just about everybody likes engines, or they like talking about engines and all that. And one of the things that I never really got into whenever I was teaching or when I was doing my working is I almost never did any kind of hot rod stuff. You know, I had one student one day that missed class, and he was telling me that he had been working on his hot rod, and I said, that's not mechanic work. And I said, what are you talking about? And he was like 19 years old and pretty good at doing the work. And I said, that's not mechanic work. He said, what do you mean that's not mechanic work? I mean, I got my hands greasy, I'm doing nuts and bolts and wrenches and stuff like that. And I said, yeah, which way's the money flowing? Yeah, his mother was giving him money to fix up his car so he could go race it at Holt, which he didn't get any money for racing it at Holt, as far as I know. Long and the short of it was, it was a toy. And I said, you get paid for putting a water pump on a minivan that belongs to a woman that's going to take money out of her purse and pay you when you get through putting the water pump on that minivan. You know, and hot rods are fun, and racing is fun to talk about and look at and all that kind of stuff. And heck, I even enjoy that little Fast and Furious cartoon that's on there. But anyway, the long and the short of it is, we're going to jump right into this kind of stuff. When you have a crank, which your crankshaft is basically a crank, even in a rotary engine, you've got a sort of a crank. And basically, you're basically turning that crank to provide power. Now, when you think about it, the longer the crank is between the handle and the center shaft, the more torque you can put on it. The shorter it is, the faster you can spin it. And that's pretty much the way pistons are too. Okay, so you're going to have, a bicycle has got a crank. Basically, you're putting your feet on the pedals of the bicycle. And you see this military guy there turning the crank on a fuel pump and all that. And then you got your, the old steam engines used to operate with that, with a piston that went back and forth. So I mean, this right here would be the crank on that. It's sort of a screwball thing. But anyway, your engine with your piston and your crankshaft is basically how that's going to have to work. Now, this is a picture of a Power Stroke diesel piston that I took. I think it's on a 6-liter when I was at the Power Stroke rally back, I don't know, 17, 18 years ago. And I was one of the journalists that was up there covering the Power Stroke rally. I was talking to one of the engineers, and he was telling me that one of these Power Stroke diesels that operate in temperature, and they found ways of measuring this, that the distance between the head of the piston and the cylinder head, you can see how close that one is, because that's a diesel. Of course, it's got that bowl in the middle of the piston. They said that thing gets hot enough that when that piston swells up, it's coming within 7/1000ths of an inch of that cylinder head, which is pretty doggone scary whenever that thing's moving as fast as it is. Whenever we used to work on those Deutsch engines for a little while, I worked at the truck shop, you were supposed to put a blob of solder on top of the piston and crank it through and let it squish the solder when it got up to the top, and then you would take the head back off because it had a bunch of jugs, kind of like an old Volkswagen bug engine. Leave it to the Germans to do that. But anyhow, the thing you would mic the piece of solder, and it was supposed to be 40/1000ths of an inch from the head of the piston to the cylinder head. And then you would put, thicker or thinner head gasket. Volkswagen diesel rabbits were like that too. You'd have the notches in the head gasket so that you know how thick the head gasket was, and you were supposed to put one back, just like it was, and all that. But that piston there, I want to click on that one more time if I can, and let it run again. You see anything wrong with that? Now that's a neat little graphic. The only problem is if you're looking at an engine that's north-south orientation, that piston's turning the wrong way, because an engine like most all cars turns that way. The only one that turn backwards are the ones where the timing belt is on the driver's side of the car. Always remember that a front-wheel drive engine is going to turn the same way the car rolls. So on some of these Mitsubishis and Honda Civics and all that, if the engine's in there backwards so that the engine's in front of the driver and the transmission's on the passenger side, you're going to have it turning, it's going to be turning counterclockwise. If the engine's in there the other way, it'll be turning clockwise. And that was something that I just started thinking about one day. Corvair engines, the old Corvair wheel drive air-cooled Corvair engines, they turn backwards to just about every other engine. If you looked at the back of a Volkswagen, it's turning clockwise. Whenever you looked at a Corvair engine, it turns counterclockwise. And you could actually take the ring gear and pinion and put them on the other side in a Volkswagen transaxle and bolt up a Corvair engine to one of those if you had the fenders and all cut out, and you could have something else. If you didn't put the ring gear on the other side of the pinion, put the Corvair engine in a Volkswagen Bug, you wound up with a car that had 4 reverse gears. Or if somebody was putting a transmission back together that wasn't paying attention, so you can actually bolt that thing together either way if you know how those were put together. And you could have a Volkswagen Bug that you put together that would go backwards every time you tried to take off and go forwards. Anyway, that's just a funny little sideline there. Alright, so what we got here is we got over square versus under square. Your piston's at bottom dead center, piston's at top dead center. There's your stroke, your bore is how much that is. If the bore and stroke are the same, it's a square engine. If it's over square, see that's over square has got a short stroke but a big piston. Under square is they got a long stroke and a skinnier piston. Okay, and so I remember one time I told in one of these videos about I had a 47 Willis Jeep I had traded my cousin Billy Joe out of, and when I took that thing apart to rebuild it, the pistons were really little and the rods were very long. It had a lot of torque, but when I got it running, it was happiest going about 40 miles an hour, and it sucked gas like you wouldn't believe. But it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The thing had a real low center of gravity. It would be hard to turn it over, Anyway, so remember this. Here's your let's start at the right place. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. Intake, compression, power, and exhaust. That's how that kind of thing goes. You're going to create energy. Now, whenever you're pulling the air in there, let's talk about that in a minute. I'll talk about that. Valve timing, though, used to be constant. Spark timing has always been variable, but for years, up until about the mid-90s, everybody pretty much had fixed valve timing. Some of the guys that were hot rodders would have camshafts that they would degree so that they would be able to change the cam timing a little bit and get themselves a little more power. This Mustang that this guy was working on over there at the Ford place, when he put it all back together, because he had to pull the head off and do something to it, put it all back together, when he drove it, it had a lot of power, but he noticed the fuel trims were skewed. One 10 plus and the other one 10 minus, on either side of zero on the fuel trims. And it turned out that he had one of the timing, one tooth off on the timing on the overhead cam on one of the heads and all that. And this other guy said, well, what if we put both of them that same amount off? Would it run that much better, maybe balance everything out? But that's you're basically degreeing the camshaft. And there's actually camshafts that are marked for stuff like that. But the camshaft spins at half crankshaft speed and must be open to valves in a proper sequence at the proper time for it to breathe properly. An engine is just a big breathing machine anyway, right? All right, so the first things first, you notice when you got gears like this together, the gear that's driving, the little crankshaft gear that's driving the camshaft gear is going to spin in an opposite direction. And so that's all got to be factored in on, when somebody's designing one like that. Now, some of you guys might have seen these Chevys where you have these little gear-driven cams where you get rid of the timing chain on a 350, and it's got a little extra set of gears that you put on either side, and you basically time it that way. And because you've added another gear, you're actually still driving the camshaft gear the same direction as the crank gear. The only problem with that is anytime you've got a camshaft that hasn't been set up so that the gears have no lash at all, Toyota uses scissor gears on their 2.2s anyway, but to keep that gear lash away, Volkswagen Bugs used to have 11 different camshaft grinds, and each one of them was a little bit different. It was 0 and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 0 or minus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when a guy was building it, he had to set it up so there was absolutely no lash. Because if you have lash with those valves having to operate those cams, it's going to rattle those gears. And General Motors and Ford's old 2.8s and their old Mustang 2s and stuff, they used to have these phenolic gears so they wouldn't rattle and all that. But they bust those gears, then you had to pull it apart and replace the gears. And then you put a metal one in there, the parts house would sell. GM had that too on some of their little 2.2 four-cylinders. They basically had little gears that were not metal. They were aluminum, and on the outside they had a soft material on the teeth so it wouldn't rattle and all. And if you knew how to get one of those out of there, you didn't have to pull a motor apart to replace that gear. You could actually drill a hole in there and tap it in the camshaft. And you could use a puller to pull the gear off and then pull it back on, with a bolt, it's another story. So this illustrates a cross flow head. You got basically, and this is not the right color, but you got your mix coming in here, the combustion takes place, and that goes out. If I'd been thinking more clearly, I'd have made that blue and that red, but that's a little bit of a screw up. These 4 strokes, intake, compression, power, and exhaust. There you are again. So, all right, here it is again. I just hammered on that. But the Earth's atmosphere is 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. The atomic weight of nitrogen is 14. The atomic weight of oxygen is 16. All right, so just remember those numbers. The atomic weight of nitrogen is 14 and oxygen is 16. All right, here's a little food for thought. How much CO2 is man-made? 100,000 random molecules of atmosphere. 35 of that 100,000 molecules are CO2. That's a little tiny little piece there. 1 molecule of that 35 is man-made CO2. All right, just think about that for just a minute now. And let's see where it goes. Okay, look at this here. Food for thought. Contribution to greenhouse effect. Natural, man-made. See the color code? Water vapor is the single most significant contributor to greenhouse gases. The little tiny bit on the very top of it up there, well, you got 0.1117%. That is your CO2. You got methane, which is, your cows tooting they're always talking about. And then you got N2O, and you got miscellaneous gases. So that's just, I wanted to give you a little atmosphere deal going there. Valve overlap is shaded in gray. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a different game whenever you've got variable valve timing, because those numbers are going to change. Some engines are slightly different than the others, but the respected norm for a very long time to scavenge the rest of the burned gas out of there, they would open the exhaust valve. They'd open the intake valve right before the exhaust valve closed. when both the intake and the exhaust valves are open at the same time, that's called overlap. And it always happens at the top dead center, right at top dead center on the exhaust stroke of that particular given cylinder. And that's what overlap's about. In order to find out how often a firing event happens on any given engine, 720 degrees is 2 full turns of the crank, which is what it takes. 4-stroke engine, you got up, down, up, down. You know, there's your 4 strokes. It takes two crank turns to do that. So you basically are going to take however many cylinders you have in the engine and divide that into 720. In other words, divide 720 by your number of cylinders. For example, on a 4-cylinder, a firing event happens every 180 degrees of crankshaft rotation. All right, so there's your intake. All right, there's your compression. All right, there's your power. I did want to say something about the power stroke. Typically, whenever you're doing a cam adjustment, or cam sensor adjustment, you're going to see that the cam sensor adjustment is done so that that little cam sensor, when you've got an adjustable cam sensor, if you actually do and I did this with an LED, and I was basically measuring, looking at how the cam sensor tool set it and all, and it's usually, it's making its cut on Fords and Chevrolets, and even on the older SHO engines, at 24 degrees after top dead center, because by that time all the fire has gone out in the cylinder. And basically your nitrogen, which is the most of what's in there anyway, is inert. Nitrogen gas is not going to burn, but what it will do when this combustion event takes place, the nitrogen gas will expand and push the piston down. That's what pushes the piston down, is the expanding nitrogen gas. And that expansion is triggered by the combustion. There's your exhaust stroke. Now let's look at those one more time. All right, there's your intake. See how we had this air coming in here with the valves open. All right, now the valves closed. The valves are closed on that stroke. They're also closed on the power stroke. And see, they got this burning all the way down, but basically that nitrogen is expanding. You notice your extra shot of fuel is already sprayed on that one and it's being stored behind the valves. Okay, and then there's your exhaust. Well, we got through with that. Now here's your lubrication. Basically you're picking up, that's actually a balance shaft down there they got that you're looking at. But see how it pumps that oil up, and the last place that oil goes is up to the top of the engine. Notice that's a pressurized lube feed going into the head like I was talking about earlier. Okay, now the thermostat's closed, the coolant flows directly to and through the heater core rather than through the radiator. Now you might notice that it bypasses through the heater core. On some of them, when they've got a little heater control valve out there that's vacuum operated, like on some of your Rangers or Mazdas and stuff like that, the heater control valve like to have 4 hoses going to it. And the reason it's got 4 hoses going to it is whenever they close the heater control valve, it doesn't stop the flow, it just bypasses the heater core. It goes right back to the engine. So if the heater core is closed off by the heater control valve, now back in the day they used to have just one little valve that would keep it from happening and the one going in. Here's the problem. If you happen to restrict the flow coming out of the heater core, and while it's still pushing pressure in there, you can bust that heater core. That's why I'm saying if you're going to pinch a heater hose, make darn sure you're pinching the one that shuts off the coolant going in, because you don't want to pinch the one coming out and have it bust that. That's terrible. All right, let's take another look at this. Here's your thermostat on this one right here, and you got a little steam hose, this little pressurized surge tank right here. This is really kind of silly because most of the time if you got a tank like this in there, you won't have a radiator cap on the radiator. It'll basically just be a plain old radiator with no cap on it. So this isn't really drawn right on most vehicles like that. But you basically, if you see that this has a pressure cap on it and that bottle is very thick and robust, then that typically means it's made to hold pressure. And this will be where you'll put your coolant in. And most of the time those kind are self-bleeding. But whenever I put coolant back in one, I like to keep, I don't know at the time, I've had to tell my students over and over and over again, particularly on one that you're filling right here, it's just got a little thin plastic surge tank over there. You better make doggone sure that thing is full of coolant before you drive it out of the shop, because you can overheat one really fast like that. And I didn't put an illustration of it up here, but I basically doctored a radiator cap so that took the spring off of it and the part that seals down in the bottom so that we just seal around the top, I'd fill the cooling system all the way up as far as I could, you know, and try to work it through there. A lot of your thermostats have got a little tiny hole in them where it'll bleed the air out. But on the older kind, I would put that on there so that it was able to come and go through this little hose as it wanted to. Of course, the ones I'm talking about went straight into that tank. They didn't go over here and all that kind of stuff. Long and short of it is, you know, and also you need to check your shop manual, make sure there's not a bleeder screw somewhere on the cooling system, because that's important. Okay, so I would crank it up and I would let it warm up, and whenever it started pushing coolant, you know, when it started to expand, and it would actually push coolant into that bottle, and I would keep this about half full, and I would watch it. And what would do is, I don't know if you've filled up a lot of these, you'll think everything is okay, and then all of a sudden the coolant goes way down and disappears. Well, if that cap's on there and that coolant can't pull air in there, it's got to pull it out of here. It basically will use what it needs out of here and keep the radiator full. That way it doesn't puke all over the floor and make a big mess with the coolant everywhere. You know, it's real easy to do that. They make these big yellow funnels you can put on there and pour it in there and do all that stuff. And that's a messy outfit too, you know, because you got to empty that funnel when you're done. There's a lot of ways to do it, but there's a little homemade tool to get an old radiator cap and get rid of the spring and the seat off the bottom of it, and just let it seal around the top of the radiator and let it burp that air out of there. It gets rid of the air it doesn't need, it pulls coolant in, and you can watch it happen. It's a pretty cool way to do that. I did that for years. Fuel delivery, you got your fuel filter and your fuel pump. This is a return line. As the pressure going in here raises the little diaphragm off of its seat, and that fuel goes back in there. Some of the engineers had said it's really not good to have a fuel return line because it changes the properties of the gasoline when it goes through the pressure and heat, and it goes back in there. So they said, let's just dispense with that. And a real common way of doing this for a long time was putting an in-tank fuel pressure regulator on there. Chrysler started doing that early on, and it was a way that they had of making a returnless fuel system where you only got one line going to that. Some of them don't even have a fuel filter out here. It's in the tank on the pump. You can't even change it unless you change out the pump. And in their mind, you know, if you're using clean fuel, you shouldn't ever have to fool with that anyway. And so your PCM, on some of them though, it will actually determine how much fuel pressure it needs, and it'll have a module that it uses to direct current or duty cycle the pump or whatever. You know, some of your GDI engines have got a low pressure, you know, they got low and they got high pressure fuel systems. I'll talk just a touch about the GDI at the end of this thing. But it's going to monitor that in a closed loop fashion, and it will change the fuel pressure as it needs to using a module to put more or less amps out in the fuel pump. If the wire shorts out down inside the gas tank, you got full pressure on the pump all the time, you'll wind up with a rich running engine and have to figure out what's going on there. I've known that happening. Ignition systems, we talked about those last week. This is just basically, you know, your old distributor and all that. You got your coil pack ignition. This first came out, as far as I know, motorcycles have been doing this firing two plugs at once for a very long time. But on the ones I'm thinking about, Buick, I think, in 1985, first came out with this system, if I remember right. Somebody might want to correct me on that, but I'm thinking Buick was the first people that did that. That's the first one I remember seeing it on. And they were pretty much ahead of everybody else on that. But you might notice that these spark plugs, this is a core in between there, and on your other kind of coil, both of the primary and the secondary wind are hooked together on one end. On this one, they don't even touch. And it pops both those plugs at the same time with the spark going this way and that way, and that kind of thing. The crank sensor provides input for ignition system. The PCM modifies spark timing on the ones that have cop coils. And those cop coils on some vehicles are really easy to burn out if something goes wrong with the PCM and it puts a dead short on the cop coil or puts too much current to it. It'll bust those cop coils. The Ford cop coils were always really irritating to find. You can take the Ford if you don't have something that'll do power balance. There's a bunch of different ways. You might have seen that GTC 505 video I have where I got Toyota Camry Adventure on a Friday morning. That little tool is really handy. You can buy one on Amazon that will cost that much. It'll analyze the ignition system something like 16 different ways. I don't have time to go into that right now. But what you can do is you can put a spark tester, the way that and this is counterintuitive if you're an ignition system guy. You pull the, on the, what Ford was having us do is you put a little plate on the top of the distributor, will pick up the fluctuations, and you flip the coil over so that it can't fire to nothing. And then you would look at the scope pattern, and they'd have a scope pattern of what it was supposed to look like and what it wasn't supposed to look like. But you can also put a spark tester on it, and you can stretch it out to about 3/4 of an inch and flip that thing up and let it fire that spark tester. If you had 8 spark testers, you could do it all at one time on one of these V8 Ford engines, and you spin it over and one of them won't be firing. You know, you can get little wands to put on it with your picoscope and all that. I had one of those at the college and all that I used and everything. All right, here's your fuel and ignition. That's just really, we're getting really close to the end here, and then we're going to go into our post test. And I'll let you guys go through the post test, and you'll see how you did on the pre-test, which is a fun thing to do. All right, GDI is a newer way to better atomize fuel coming out of a GDI injector. The fuel is almost pure vapor coming out of there. You wouldn't believe how tiny those droplets are. It's almost like smoke, how much it comes out of there. The fuel spray from a GDI injector can be inserted at any point during piston travel that the PCM chooses. And stratified injection, you know, the cool thing about that, whenever the fuel injector on a regular engine squirts, it actually is right behind the valve, and it has to wait until the valve opens before it goes in the cylinder. And so there's a little bit of a, and you can see, and the atomization coming out of those fuel injectors is not as good as what you're getting on a GDI injector. And GDI engines have a little higher compression too, as I remember. Long and short of it is, you can actually start the fire and then feed it some more fuel and stratify. Now it only does that on a cold engine, and it does it to heat up the light off cap. So it's not going to do that whenever you're, you know, driving trying to pull a load. The homogeneous injection happens, believe it or not, it sprays the fuel in there during the compression stroke before the spark plug fires. Now the spark timing is going to be like it always was, but it can actually spray the fuel in there early and let it be squeezed and swirled around and better handled, and that gives you your power and all that. And you're running usually between 300 and 500 pounds at idle. This is just me talking off the top of my head, and between 2,000 and 4,000 pounds when you're at a heavy load in the common rail. But they have a fuel system just like the old MPI vehicles that's feeding the fuel rail. There's a hydraulic, there's a mechanical pump that's riding on a little three-lobe on the end of the camshaft. On those, it's really important to keep the oil changed on those, because if you don't, you'll wind up wiping out your camshaft and your little expensive pump and all that. And the pump, the high pressure pump, has got a little pressure control solenoid on it, so the engine controller can read a fuel rail pressure sensor in the fuel rail, and it can loop that in and keep that pressure right where it's supposed to be. That's a GDI thing. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to let you guys do the post test and to see how you did. I hope you enjoyed this video. Some of it was review. Hopefully I told you some stuff you didn't know. But enjoy the post test and send me some feedback on how you liked it and how you did on it. Until next time, we'll see you later.